So the next thing to talk about here is migration, demographic changes, and minorities. So as we are mobilizing to fight this war, there's a lot of movement within American society. Millions of men are volunteering or being drafted into the armed forces. Women are going to enter the workforce to take the jobs that they're leaving behind or the jobs that are created that there are not men there to take. Also, this is going to present lots of opportunities for minorities in the United States in job creation and military service. So there's lots of movement in American society, lots of people moving around. So there are an increase in factory jobs that are causing millions to leave rural areas, both, the majority of America, white America, and minority America. So there are jobs in the Midwest, there are jobs along the Pacific coast. There's even new defense installations located in the South because of the low labor costs and warm climate. So there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of change going on in the way that Americans are working and where they're living and where they're working. So one of the biggest groups, or the biggest group that is impacted by all this change, is African Americans. Many attracted by jobs in the North and the West finally leave the South. Over 1.5 million African Americans left the South during this time. And we call this the Great Migration. This is when there truly are greener pastures on the other side of the hill, and people understand that there are opportunities out there. Adjust that, that got a little distorted there. There we go. All right. So we see lots of people moving out of the South. So you see people going up to the Midwest, into the cities like Detroit, where there's more factory jobs. You see them going out west into cities like Los Angeles and San Diego, where there are jobs making ships for the Navy. You see people from the Midwest moving to the West, people from the West going back to the Midwest, right? So there's all this movement of people to different military installations, different factories, different cities, as we start to see people move around. Look at this shift from the Northeast to the South like that, over 1 million people because of the defense industries that are down there, right? So lots of movement of people, but huge movements of African Americans as they start to resettle. All right, so another way that African Americans are moving around is through military service, right? Over 1 million African Americans joined the armed services. Now, they still face discrimination. They had to serve in segregated units. They had to have white officers. The military itself was still segregated this time and won't be desegregated until Truman does it by executive order after World War II. And with all of this movement, there was resentment. There was resentment in the armed forces. Honestly, some of the segregation in the armed forces limited that. There was also resentment and tension with the movement of African Americans to different areas around the country. There were actually some race riots in Detroit and New York during the summer of 1943. Milwaukee had some tension here. Alice Chalmers was making a lot of military equipment, and we saw a large, African-American population moving into the north side of Milwaukee to take advantage of those jobs, and that caused some tension and some resentment. But along with this, too, in every war that the United States have fought, African-Americans have served, whether it be honestly the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, African Americans get involved to try to fight for their democracy and their equality. Right? Even though slavery is over, we're not even close to an equal status for African Americans in the United States in World War II. So what the NAACP and other early civil rights organizations launched was something called the Double V campaign: victory over fascism abroad, and victory at home, equality at home, right? Double V, victory at home, victory abroad. So we will defeat the fascists abroad, and that will help us defeat the racist segregationists back home. NAACP membership increased. Another group was founded during this time called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, founded in 1942. And we started to see African Americans be more militant and more forceful in their demanding of equal rights. If I go out and risk my life and fight for democracy abroad, I better come home and have some awaiting me when I get back from the Pacific or Europe. So we start to see the civil rights campaign take a whole new tone and a whole new kind of process and energy into America after World War II. Really, the civil rights movement wouldn't have gotten going in the 1950s if you hadn't first had an enormous mobilization of African Americans participating in World War II. Because hey, if you go defeat the Nazis, You really going to come home and be scared of some segregationists? You're really going to come home and accept being a second-class citizen? I don't think so, right? And there are lots of people in white America who saw that too and said, they've done their part. It's time that we start to change these things. So there was huge impacts in the African American community from their participation in World War II. As we all fought together as Americans to preserve our democracy and to keep democracy safe abroad. Mexican Americans also saw some big changes. Over 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the armed forces. Again, there's some segregation, there's some resentment, but over 300,000 Mexican Americans served. Also in 1942, we realized we needed Mexico's help again, right? When I talk about Mexican Americans serving in the armed forces, I'm talking about, registered American citizens that are signing up and enlisting to fight. But now, remember, when we were talking about the Great Depression, during the Great Depression is the first time that we closed the border with Mexico and we said we want our agricultural jobs to be for white Americans. Well, guess what? Now in World War II, there are no white Americans left to function and fulfill all those agricultural jobs in the American Southwest. So in 1942, we started the Braceros program. Braceros. B-R-A-C-E-R-O-S, the Braceros program. This allowed Mexican farm workers, known as the Braceros, to enter the U.S. in harvest season without going through the formal immigration process. So that way we could have enough food and production to be able to feed both our army and the Allied armies as well. Now, this did again lead to some tension. In Los Angeles in the summer of 1943, you had something called the Zoot Suit riots because of this, where Mexicans and Americans clashed in the streets over the tension over housing and jobs and new people moving into new neighborhoods. But Mexican Americans served just as African Americans proudly and bravely in the war and helped us together all fight to maintain our freedom and spread democracy abroad. For Native Americans, only about 25,000 served in the armed forces. Now, part of this is because they're a very smart population, part is because they're an autonomous nation on their reservations. But many worked in the defense industries. There's also a well-known group called the Navajo Code Talkers that helped break code in the Pacific, but more specifically could use the Navajo language as code in the Pacific because no one knew it outside of the Navajo Americans. There's been some movies and stuff made about that too. Now, the really bad part about minorities and movement during World War II is the treatment of Japanese Americans. Now, 20,000 Japanese Americans served in the armed forces. A lot of tension, a lot of suspicion there. But the big thing going on with Japanese Americans is that they were forced into internment camps along the West Coast because it was believed that they could be, saboteurs or spies, and that if Japan invaded the West Coast, all of the Japanese Americans would rise up and help the Japanese, and they had been planted there, and they'd serve as spies, and they would, sabotage American efforts. So eventually, over 100,000 Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps along the West Coasts. Now, obviously, these camps aren't awful. They're not death camps. These are not Holocaust camps. Okay? We're not shoving Japanese Americans into these prison camps, these internment camps. Let's call it what it is. It's a prison camp. We're not sending them there to die. But at the same time, these were hastily constructed. They're primarily in the desert regions of the West Coast, which get very cold at night. They're in dorms with no insulation, very little heating. The food is not good. The treatment from the guards is not good. It was basically like you were forced into a prison with absolutely no habeas corpus, no due process. Right? Eventually, there was a Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus United States in 1944. Korematsu versus United States in 1944, where the Supreme Court upheld the internment policy as a necessary war measure. Now, later on, in 1988, the federal government agreed that a great injustice had been done, and everyone who was still alive who had been imprisoned received some financial compensation. But there were all these camps along the West Coast, and then others spread throughout the country that served different roles where you could see these internment camps, these prison camps, right? And you can see all the different types of them. we assemble them together, we relocate them, we isolate them, a temporary camp or some type of Justice Department facility tied to it. You can see in Wisconsin, we had a Justice Department internment camp at Camp McCoy. So if you were found guilty of some crime or accused of some crime in one of these internment camps, they sent you to Wisconsin for one of your trials, right? Separate you from your family for a while. So these internment camps are a huge shame in American history, but it's one of the few shameful moments in American history that we've actually made right on, right? In 1988, the government says, yeah, this was bad, we shouldn't have done this, and we're sorry about it, so here's some financial compensation. So at least we made good on it. My son is now bawling. I'm going to pause this and go attend to my kid real quick. Okay, when it came to women, again, lots of change here, lots of movement, lots of opportunity. Just as in World War I and the Civil War and the American Revolution and every other war we fought in, women played a vital role to the U.S. war effort. Over 200,000 women served in non-combat roles in the military. Now, what does that mean? You can be support staff, you can be secretarial, you could be a typist, you could do, lots of office work. My grandma Jackie was an Army nurse. So she was a nurse, she signed up, she was stationed in Texas, and when you were well enough to come back from the front, where they could transport you back home to an Army hospital in the United States, Grandma Jackie was there waiting for you, right? So lots of women served in lots of different ways. Almost 5 million women took jobs left or vacated by men, right? Left, vacated by men, or new jobs that were created. They worked in industrial plants, they worked in shipyards. Now, unfortunately, the pay they received was well below that of a male factory worker, but these were still new opportunities open to women that hadn't been there before that allowed them to make some money and see the world. My grandma Jackie talked about, she was from Iowa. She's just a nurse from Iowa. If she wouldn't have gone out and, driven down to Texas with some of her girlfriends and then made some money and bought a Ford Mustang and drove back and eventually decided to move towards the Madison area of Wisconsin, she never would have met my grandpa, right? And I wouldn't be here. So there are these opportunities that were open. Now, of course, some of these opportunities close. When men come home, it's assumed that they're going to take the factory jobs that women had been working, but they still gained knowledge, they still gained expertise, and they also started to gain kind of some of that militant activism and push for equality that African Americans gained during the war as well, where a lot of women said, I did this for 4 years, I'm not going to really take it. I was part of the war effort, I did my fair share. I'm not going to accept a second class existence in my society because of my gender, right? Now, there's still going to be, of course, more work to be done for all these minority groups, but we see huge changes, and that's something that is such a common aspect in American history, but all history, and I've kind of been harping on that throughout this video. None of this is new. It's not like, African Americans and Native Americans and Mexican Americans and women, this is like the first war that they've helped out, and they've always helped out, because people understand that from these moments of turmoil, from these moments of adversity, there are opportunities, right? Whenever adversity strikes, there's an opportunity. Are you going to run from the trouble, or are you going to run towards it? Are you going to become terrified from the change, or are you going to find a way to benefit from that change, right? And that's what people that make history do. A lot of times, it's not that big of a deal, right? It's just someone who says, what? I'm fighting for democracy abroad. I'm an African American fighting in Europe. When I get home, I want to try to make my country better too and increase equality. So I'm going to join the NAACP. And then a couple other million people do that, and all of a sudden the NAACP has a bankroll. They can hire good lawyers. They get their good marshal. All of a sudden Brown versus Board of Education versus Topeka, Kansas happens, and all of a sudden we start to desegregate schools. Right? It can be very, very small, simple things. One woman goes to work in an industrial plant in California, and she works as a riveter, right? And now we have Rosie the Riveter that people dress up like on Halloween, that has become a symbol for the equality of women in the United States and still is today, right? It's a lot of time these changes are there. These changes present themselves, and there's opportunities there, and there's just ordinary people stepping in, taking a chance, trying to address this change and make it positive. And before you know it, we see massive changes in our country's history and world history, right? And it's no different in World War II. Millions and millions of people just doing what they think is right for themselves and for their country, and ultimately propelling us into a level of prosperity and change in post-World War II America that we had never seen before. The prosperity will be enormous. The change will be enormous. None of these things happen if it isn't for all of these people moving to new areas, migrating to new areas, shifting into new jobs, taking advantage of opportunities from adversity. That's what it's all about. So that is World War II Part 6, Migration, Demographic Changes, and Minorities. Next time I see you, we'll start to talk about fighting the war and see how eventually the Allies are victorious. We'll also talk about the controversy over dropping the atomic bombs. Great job with these videos. See you next time, ladies. Keep up all your great work. Adios.